I am honored to be sponsored by the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and by Danny and Nader, and to have Andrea commenting, and for all of you to have come. The topic relates to, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experiences going to Palestine with a civil rights delegation. It was a civil rights delegation with about 10 black people who were active in the civil rights movement, including Dorothy Cotton, who was the education director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the only woman in the leadership when Martin Luther King led it, and Vincent Harding, who invited me and is a close friend, and he was a close friend of Dr. King's. In fact, King asked him to move to Atlanta, and when he came to Atlanta, he lived 5 doors down, he and his wife, from the Kings, and he was roughly King's alter ego. And when King was on the road 300 days a year and had to compose the speech in which he finally was going to say publicly in a way that could not be denied that the Vietnam War was a horror and that what America was doing was my government, the most violent government in the world, and how it related to the civil rights movement, he asked Vincent to write the draft of that speech. So I often find that I have lunch with Vincent and he suggests things that I do, including that one, and so I'm off. I'm sort of like the Hobbit in that respect. He sweeps me off. So, and there are many other interesting people in the civil rights movement. There were also 2 rabbis. One, Brian Walt, who had been a left-wing Zionist all his life, and on the apartheid Jews-only road in Hebron, heavily guarded, in which the Palestinian shops are all shut and the windows grated over because they're still in the houses because they have titles from the Ottomans, the parents, or the British Mandate, but they're going to be dispossessed. And the windows are grated because settlers' children and others will throw rocks at them. And they can go out the back and take 15 minutes to get around to the cemetery across the street or go get some food. He went on this Jews-only road and he said to himself, he fell to the ground as Saul on the way to Damascus, and he said, I have been silent too much about apartheid, and I will no longer be. This is a group that is as sympathetic to Jews for the reasons that one might be sympathetic. A group so knowledgeable about the Holocaust, and I don't speak of myself only, but I sometimes characterize myself as an anti-Nazi professionally. I spent a lot of my life fighting fascism and racism. And if you read my work, one of the reasons why I studied black soldiers in the American Revolution, and the New York Times will barely print stories about Jefferson op-ed pieces as a slaveholder, and will say, you know, there may be 5 Crispus Attuxes, but will not say what a German private said, who walked around the field at Yorktown, fought on American side with the French. He said, most of the dead at Yorktown are Moors, black people. Most of the dead on both sides at the crucial battle of the American Revolution that defeated Cornwallis are black people. So my book gives a full account of that on both sides, how that happened. And it was supposed to get printed. It's Chicago's lead book in history, and it sells for $30. So my son occasionally gets fantasy novels for $30 once in a while. It's not the most wildly expensive book, and they're putting it out in paperback in the fall. But, in fact, I'll pass the book around. This is the book. Do you want to start it out? And to look at the American Revolution in this way requires that one not be affected in the same way that most historians have been, sometimes quite innocently. People are often against racism, some. But, you know, is somebody who escapes from slavery a runaway? or are they a person seeking freedom? Well, they are a person seeking freedom, and slaveholders are pretty bad, as we can tell from Django. So, you know, it's nice that the culture is getting around to noticing that actually, if you fight in the Warsaw Ghetto, it's not 6 of 1 what you think and what the Nazis who wipe you out think. There's one side that's basically right and one side that's wrong, and one side that has to be stopped and the other side that needs to find a way to live. So I'm going to talk to you about founding amnesias, and I'll tell you a little bit about, in 2 parts, and then I'll tell you about the trip. 2 parts of this. My book is relevant to the fact that we hear that the American founding guys, the patriarchy, are for freedom. And about the Bill of Rights, that's true. And Tom Jefferson did write the Declaration of Independence, and there are a couple of really creepy sentences in it saying King George is trying to stir up domestic insurrections, by which he means slave revolts, right? In which favoring Tom is not the obvious thing to do, and to sick the merciless Indians upon us. But the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness point is as basic to what we think about individual freedom as anything gets, and is worth taking in and remembering. But the other side is that many, many of them were slave owners. And I'll just give you a little example. From 1788 and the election of George Washington to 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln, the president was a slave owner 52 of those 72 years. And the only presidents elected twice were slave owners. Now, there's some furor about Django because, you know, Tarantino, he jazzes things up and he tells comic stories and this and that. I will just tell you I spent 16 years with slavery. And I don't think Tarantino gets how bad it is myself. I don't think it's easy to get how bad it is. And if you know that America was founded by slave owners and America was made clean, as the film Lincoln shows us, by the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, to the extent that America has been made clean in this regard, you know, you feel differently about the founders. And that's good because really, just like in Israel and Palestine, we too need a new start. We too are just taking steps now. I'm also a John Evans professor, and this city was founded in the butchery of the Native Americans at Sand Creek. A butchery so horrible that amidst the general attack on Native Americans which characterized the United States, sweeping them across the country and killing lots and lots of people, and denying that they were people, and denying that they were there. Sand Creek stands out because the federal government, because of the testimony of 2 noble guys, Silas Sewell and Joseph Kramer, actually recorded the truth about it. And there's a monument to Sand Creek because Ben Nighthorse Campbell read the letters that those 2 guys wrote. It was his only speech into the Senate record. And the story of what the citizens of Denver, the 100 Daysters, did at Sand Creek in cutting women open and murdering their babies and throwing children and babies away, and all the rest of it is beyond bearing. And so in Arapahoe County, hey, there are any Arapahoes in Arapahoe County? Maybe you run across any Arapahoes out there? Arapahoe Road, any Arapahoes? Fort Lyon, there was a treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851 that gave all of Colorado, they were moving them out, to the Cheyennes and the Arapahoes and the Ute Indians. And there ain't, after Sand Creek and the Civil War and the building of the railway, Native Americans in Colorado. When they come back to do a run in memorial of Sand Creek from the site of the massacre in southern Colorado to the state capitol where John Evans and John Chivington are still memorialized, they do that spirit run not as Coloradans, but as people from out of state. But they were the original people here. So this idea about founding amnesias is a big deal. I'll tell you a little bit about Vincent's experience. Vincent grew up in Harlem downstairs from a fellow who was Jewish. And he thought of himself as a kid as maybe being Jewish for a while. And the teachers who recognized that he was a very talented guy were Jewish. And he went to the City University of New York that was 96% Jews. City College, not City University. It's now City University. And he told the story. I went to grade school with Andrew Goodman, and this is a name that may or may not be familiar to you. It's a long time ago. It's Walden School in New York, and we were friends, and I was there from 1st to 4th grade, so we were young friends and were in touch somewhat thereafter. And I almost went on a freedom ride in Mississippi Freedom Summer, and Andy Goodman joined Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney, and they went with SNCC to do voter registration in Mississippi, and they went to a burned out church because the preacher had said that he would register people to vote, and their car broke down, and they were picked up by the sheriff, and at midnight they were turned over to a mob, and they disappeared for 6 weeks, and there was a bigger manhunt than the one in Boston. And they found their bodies buried in a dam, mutilated, particularly Chaney's, who was black. And Vincent was involved in that project and knew Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney well. He did not meet Andy, who had just been in Mississippi one day when this happened. He was just a kid who believed in equality from New York, a Jewish kid, just like me, who believed in equality from New York. I had been on a terrible freedom ride in Chestertown, Maryland. So it happened I was scared to go to Mississippi, and it happened that nobody asked me, right? I could easily have gone, and I have often gone on things that are dangerous. So Vincent said, he told the following story. When we were in Palestine, we rode around on a bus, and Dorothy would begin everything with singing songs, Dorothy and Vincent. So it was like being right back in the 60s, and we were singing songs. And he said the following thing about it. When they had heard that these 3 people had disappeared, they knew they had been murdered. And so Bob Moses, who was one of the leaders of SNCC, stood up. He's a very good guy. And he said, look, this is a terrible thing. And we want everybody to take a day and call whoever you need to call and talk to whoever you need to talk to and ask them whether you should come home. And think about it. And he said they all got together in groups and talked about it and sang some of the songs of the civil rights movement. And somehow those songs gave them vision and courage, and not one person went home. Not one. So when people said there was a Jewish-black alliance in the civil rights movement, as there was about jazz, that's no kidding. Right? Every one of these people was inclined to defend Israel. Now, I say that because everybody who was there, what you saw was a police state which administers Jim Crow. It administers apartheid. It administers it in so horrifying and calculated a way that, at least for me, I will say I knew a lot about it before, and I have long been a big critic of Israel. I don't think that the way Israel puts its boot on the neck of ordinary people in Palestine is a way to make peace. And I think the United States, in giving $3 billion a year in military aid to Israel, which is mainly aid to rotten American military companies, that's how they get their sales. I don't think that's doing any good. But it was visceral to see it, and I will try to make that a little bit apparent. One of the people who went on the trip is Clay Carson, who has edited Martin Luther King's papers. He teaches at Stanford. One of his best students was a guy named Ramzi Makdizi. And he'd also had some correspondence with Ramzi. And Ramsey played the role of Martin Luther King in a play that Clay wrote in Palestine. And the point of it was to encourage nonviolence, because we met with a lot of people who were doing nonviolent resistance to Israeli oppression. So he talked with us, and it turned out he's from an old East Jerusalem family. They have lived there for years. The territory is now occupied, and they're not citizens. They're permanent residents. That's declared by the state of Israel. Israel makes them non-persons. He went to study in Barcelona. You might think, I mean, let's say Israel were the government, a civilized government, which it isn't. You might think they would foster education and foster learning, right? Because how are Palestinians going to survive and make it better for themselves if nobody goes and studies anywhere and nobody does any learning? Well, he went to Barcelona to study, and he lives in Barcelona now. He can't stay in the occupied territories. He had to leave in February of this year. His permanent residency was taken away by Israel because he went and studied abroad. Guy's teaching him Martin Luther King. I wonder why that's inimical to the goals of Israel. Why Palestinian nonviolence is something which is treated with such ferocity. I went to 4 villages. One of them is Nabi Saleh. The family there, they're all interrelated. It's about 1,000 people. They're all called Tamimis. There are a lot of Tamimis. So I met a little girl named Jana, whose father is the leader of the thing, Bessim Tamimi. And Jana had a close friend, her best friend, Mustafa Tamimi. And Mustafa Tamimi was hit by a tear gas canister made by Consolidated Systems, Inc. That's an American company, the one that made all the tear gas canisters in Egypt. And if it hits you the wrong way, it blew up his face, and it killed him. He was 27 years old. He was in a nonviolent protest against the separation wall, which cuts off their olive trees, which maybe I'll just tell you. Olive trees there are olive trees that date back to the time of Christ. And in Nabi Saleh, there's one called Hadra. And if people mention Hadra, they don't mean the old woman named Hadra, they mean the olive tree named Hadra. It's a very powerful thing. And the settlers and their children come and set the trees on fire. And so the Palestinians ask, and many Jews, by the way, right? There are Jews who see what's going on. Why do you set this tree that prays to heaven on fire? Now that's their livelihood, right? But Israel and the settlers want to drive them out. Israel subsidizes about 800,000 settlers, some of whom are fanatics from Brooklyn. There are a lot of people from Brooklyn who go over there and they want to have Judean Samaria in the occupied territories, and they want to chase people out. So if you're a kid in these demonstrations, you may get shot with these. By the way, we would go around, they would take us by the wall, and there were hundreds of silver canisters. And we were told not to pick them up, but the kids were kind of nudging them, and so it's hard not to pick them up. And if you looked at them, you could find Consolidated Systems, Inc. on it. And there were rubber bullets, hard as rock, black, round. And if one of them hits you in the wrong place, you're dead. So she had gone and she had sung a song about the heroism of people, little boys, throwing rocks at the oppressors and saying who is right and who is wrong. And she went to the Israeli troops, who were mainly younger than you. They're mainly 19 years old or less. And these are kids who are trying to get through it for the most part and who have to obey orders. And in the occupied territories, well, these nonviolent demonstrators come down, so you fire tear gas at them, and then you fire live ammunition at them. I was sitting up on the roof of one of the houses with the rest of the people in the delegation, and we were in easy range. They had tried to keep us out of there, the Israeli Defense Forces. And they were shooting at us. Well, not at us, at them. Live ammunition. I watched them being arrested. One of the kids couldn't get away. And actually, as far as it went, they represented exactly no threat to Israel except that they were breathing while Palestinian. All this weaponry, all of this. Children there think that white people who are decent are unusual. I have one student, actually, who had some rocks thrown at her once by a 5-year-old, and she eventually went with her older sister she was staying with, who told the kid that, you know, not all Westerners are bad, to his house and found out that his dad had been jailed for 12 years for the first nonviolent intifada. He'd gotten out in time so that he could be conceived, and then was put in jail again. So let's talk about the inequality of it. I mentioned what happened to Ramzi and whether you study abroad. This is not a problem for Israeli students, right? The walls, with the separation wall, has cameras in it that will see into houses 5 kilometers away. Women no longer go around houses at all in anything like Muslim women don't anyway. But, you know, there's no relaxing in your house. And they photograph people who are in these demonstrations. And they show up at houses at 2 in the morning, and they rouse a 13, 14, 15-year-old kid out of bed. And they take him down to the jail, and they hold him for 8 days, and they torture him. And then they have a military trial, and they likely hold him for another 4 months. Now, I will just tell you that it's a grand thing that people engage in nonviolence, given this. Because if you ask me, I used to be a big fan of John Brown, and I was for a long time a violent revolutionary. And while I think nonviolence is by far the wisest and most decent way to go, I would just say that if you did this to my kid, I would want to do you some harm. And I would not see you, I would see you as the Jews saw the Europeans when they were in the ghetto. I would not see you as a Jew. So, what about a settler's kid? The Israeli Defense Forces occupy the territory, and by the way, they've corrupted the Palestinian Authority, so they even spy on people who oppose the regime. And I'm sorry, this is well, I'll just describe this to you. In addition to the Jews-only road I was describing before, Shahuda Street, it's built through the center of the old bazaar, and it has destroyed and shut down the old bazaar. So we were taken around by a Palestinian kid who couldn't go up on Shahuda Street, so he was replaced by one of the Israeli soldiers, a guy named Natan, breaking the silence to talk to us when we were in Jews-only territory. So we went through the bazaar, and everything's deserted, and he said, I came here with my father holding me by his hand. I was dangling when I was tiny, and the place is full of chickens. And now, you know, about 100 yards off down an alleyway, there was one set of scraggly chickens. And people were desperate to sell things. They had beautiful things to sell because nobody came through there because the Israeli army had harassed and destroyed the thing for these settlers. So they put netting up above it, and you could see the rocks in the netting because settlers' children who are stoked on racism come and throw rocks on it. But that isn't the only thing they do. They also get tubs of feces and urine and throw that on it. That's interesting to talk to people there. As I say, if you had said to me before I went there, oh, they did something like that, you know, I would have said, wow, right? They didn't tell me that. The articles they write don't tell you that. I will say that there wasn't one of us in this group who wasn't appalled. The settlers' children, if they were to be arrested for this, would go to a civilian court and be out within a day. They would have habeas corpus. They're not arrested because, as the Israeli defense, quote-unquote, forces say, we're there to protect. settlers. We're not there to enforce the rule of law. There is no rule of law for Palestinians. It's all behind a wall. So, you know, if you're in Israel, you might forget that it was there. But there are a lot of people in Israel, particularly religious fanatics, which is one section of the population, or it's not a section, there are a few leaders of it who are religious fanatics, who are very, very extreme. They want to take over Judea and Samaria, and they want to drive these people out. And the fact that the occupation is illegal and immoral, and that the defense of it, I don't know if you know the story of, do people here know about Avraham Berg? Yeah. So anyway, Berg was a leader of the Knesset, and I'll just tell you quickly. He was a man of conscience, and he read one day about a grandmother, an Arab, I believe it was in Lebanon, may have been in Syria, being killed by an Israeli rocket watching her two granddaughters. They're all killed. And he went to the dinner party with his friends, and he said, we did this terrible thing today. And one of them leaped to say, but we're not as bad as the Nazis. And that finished Avraham Berg. That's when he changed, just like Rabbi Walt when he was on Yehuda Street, right? That, you know, there are a lot of things that you could say positively for Israel if you thought it was a democracy. It is working to be a Jewish state, meaning an anti-Palestinian state. The democracy is being undercut every minute. And what it is enforcing toward the Palestinians is unbearable. And so, as Mira Haas says, they fight back. Sometimes they throw rocks. Now, it's terrible if one of those rocks hits somebody and hurts them. That's true. On the other hand, it's completely an act of self-defense. And for a government which shoots people who engage in nonviolence, to talk about the violence of rock throwing, you'll excuse me if I say, it is only the double standard, which is also true here, right? That is to say, if you want the biggest violent government in the world, as Martin Luther King says, is the United States. I campaign for Barack and I love him, but those drones are blowing up civilians right now in Yemen and Somalia and Pakistan and several other countries that we are not at war with. And unless I'm mistaken, that's both aggression and murder of innocents, a lot of it. And the American Congress and the American elite can't quite figure out whether even when Americans get killed, who are in Yemen, like this kid, Avlaki's kid, the 16-year-old looking for his father and his 16-year-old friend, who were blown up with a food stand with 10 other people, they can't figure out whether this is bad. Well, I'm sorry, I'm familiar with atrocities, and I have the innocent belief that every human life is sacred and every child is of equal value, which is, I'm afraid, not an American government value. And so they're having a debate now about whether it's good to do this. I'll just tell you, they are making enemies for the United States like this child, the 5-year-old I mentioned before. And I'm not an enemy of the United States at all. I would love the United States to be a lot better. And I am thrilled that Barack is president, that a black guy who's the smartest guy in the room got elected, I mean the elite, got elected president 40 years after Martin Luther King was shot. I'll tell you, that means something to me. I'm very leftist, but I had to deal with many of my leftist friends who said, they're all no good. So we haven't bombed Iran yet because Barack is president. And we would have bombed Iran. It was McCain's theme song, and we would have bombed Iran yesterday if Romney had been elected. There's a big difference. Anyway, this thing about the Palestinians being deprived of a livelihood, here's another one. I'll just tell you one more story. We walked down the Jericho Road with a young woman who is in the Organization Against Housing Demolitions, because they demolished Palestinian houses, ICAD, and is also part of Anarchists Against the Wall, an heroic organization in Israel in which Jews, at the risk of their lives, go and support nonviolent Palestinian resistance in the occupied territories. They just go support. And they've been doing it for 9 years, and they get 40 to 100 people, and they go and get shot at. And they're very, very courageous people, and she was one of them. So she's shown us down the oldest road in civilization, the Jericho Road. Jericho Road is now divided by the wall. So we got to the wall, which one of the guys in our group, Lucas, knew was bigger. He spent some time in Berlin, bigger than the Berlin Wall. It divides a Palestinian house in two, so the two brothers who cannot go across the wall because they can't get permission from Israel to go across the wall communicate with each other over the rooftop with the separation running in between them. It's good that they can communicate, I guess, in that way. So we went down, and there was this beautiful, shiny settlement, and there are 500 of them in the territories. They're these pink roofs, and they're really like an American suburb. I mean, maybe a little nicer. And the Israeli government, although it gouges people, Netanyahu is responsible for sicking the free market on people such that nobody can rent a house, and there were huge demonstrations in Israel a year and a half ago about housing prices. And not self-conscious enough to realize that there was some link between what Israel's doing in the occupied territories and what's happening to people in Israel. It's beautiful. There were little playgrounds, and you could see some kids playing. And so the question, what the kids are learning growing up, is actually an interesting question. Because you reach the end of the sidewalk, and it's all broken. And that's where the Palestinians live. And the Israeli government controls the water. So you can tell a Palestinian house because it has a black water tank up on the roof to collect the rain. And one of the innovations of an American company is it produces something called skunk gas. And what this is gas that makes you smell like a skunk has sprayed you. And it's much harder to get off than skunk spray because it's the chemicalized version, sort of like the fast food version of skunk spray. So, please, you got my joke. In the occupied territories, when I was in Nabi Saleh, I watched them spray this gas into the water tanks of the Palestinians so that even the rainwater they would not have. Now, Palestinians are human, and I have committed the indiscretion of noticing that for many years, so I had my car windshield smashed for speaking nonviolently at a memorial to Der Yassin on this campus. That was about 7 or 8 years ago. Maybe it's a little longer. This is a rough show. If you say Palestinians are human, that's not something that is tolerable among the people who have a lot of influence in Congress like AIPAC. And they will defame you often. And there are a lot of famous people who have uttered thoughts like Jimmy Carter. He said there's apartheid there. There's apartheid there. But the truth is that both Jews and Palestinians have the most universities in the world, except for Israel probably. They got many, many universities. They are a very studious people. They really want to change things. Lots of women go to these universities. And they would love to change things. And if you think of a Middle East which had around the Mediterranean a new economy and an economic union like Europe in 50 years, you could imagine Jews and Palestinians participating in that and being pretty well off. I mean, as well off, you know, modern life is pretty alienated and uncomfortable, but pretty well off. To realize that not very far dream will take a lot. It will take a lot of pushing. It will take a lot of defeating of racism and amnesias. It will take a lot of setting things right. Because nobody ought to be treated like people are in the occupied territories. And there are two things. One, it means that the armed revolt that they have is feeble compared to Israel and ridiculous often and completely counterproductive like Hamas. But it's not unjustified. But it would be far better if they pursued nonviolence. And I'll just say one last thing. The boycott, divestment, and solidarity movement just realized a great victory in Berkeley, California. The student government voted to divest. It is a great, great, great victory. And 100 professors at Barnard and Columbia wrote a letter about why Columbia should divest. And that'll put pressure on Israel to change this, and something has to put pressure on Israel to change this. Thank you.
For those of you who may have come during Professor Gilbert's remarks, we are now going to hear from our discussant this afternoon, Professor Andrea Stanton, who teaches religious studies and Islamic history here at DU and is an affiliate faculty member of the Center for Middle East Studies. Andrea.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you so much. There's so much more that I can say than I will take time to say. But I would like to just offer a couple comments, partly relating from a historian's perspective and partly on a political perspective. But I thought I might start by, for those of you who have been at some of the other center events this spring, note that I think that what you have done is also to connect a kind of complicated strand that's come out in some of these events, and I'm thinking specifically of the question of nonviolent resistance. And for those of you who came to the Syria conference in January, Dorothy also talked about this and noted that she's been part of the nonviolent resistance in Syria from March 2011, but that the challenge is that nonviolent resistance is invisible in so many cases. It's not media friendly, it's not media savvy, it doesn't compete well with blood, but her argument is that it continues and it's crucial, and therefore it's important to encourage people to pay attention to this. For her, in looking at Syria, the nonviolent strands, particularly the LCCs, are crucial for some kind of similarly peaceful future for Syria. And I think that might also connect with one of the comments that Stephen Zunis made when he was speaking here, which was that in looking at the Arab uprisings of the past 2.5 years, generally speaking, he said that there have been many places, not so much Libya, elsewhere, in which nonviolence has been a key strand in the resistance to a dictatorial government. But his concern was that that nonviolence has been a tactic rather than a strategy, that it has been a kind of choice by default rather than a deliberate choice. And to make the deliberate choice is the crucial step. It needs to be a strategic decision rather than a tactical decision. And as you note, nonviolence is not the natural response to repression. It is not the natural response to seeing your family injured, your home destroyed. And so it is a tremendously difficult kind of counterintuitive decision that must be made again and again. And it also requires, as your experiences speak very much to, a commitment to a very, very slow process of change. So it requires both courage and patience. And I think what you ended on is also a reminder of the need for political support beyond that of the people who are themselves engaging in nonviolent resistance. The economic argument that it would be better for Israel if it were integrated into the region has been made over and over and again. It's been utterly unpersuasive. And so the idea of political support as political pressure as being the more persuasive element in causing a shift in a national identity, I think is one that we might think about. So just a couple comments as from a historical perspective. It's such a pleasure to even be near you. Your life, I think, has been such a tremendous illustration of engaged scholarship. You are what I dream of being in a more courageous version of myself. But I think you're well, I don't know about that. But I think you also, in your own personal life and in your research, also illustrate what for me as a historian is one of the key elements of historical scholarship, which is that you get the answers to the questions you ask. And if you aren't asking good questions, if you aren't asking questions that go beyond the accepted narrative, the answers you get follow that accepted narrative. And I think you can talk about that in terms of your earlier work, in terms of your position as John Evans Professor, in terms of your work on the American Revolution, and in terms of this question of what does it mean to have a new narrative, not for Palestine, I want to say something more about that, but for Israel. And I think that is precisely it. What is the story in Palestine, and why does that matter in Israel? And you use the term founding amnesia, and I think for those of us in general who study nation building and nationalism, it's a helpful reminder that nation building is a project of forgetting as well as remembering, and that more than that, that forgetting is an active process. It takes a tremendous amount of labor, of effort, of mental effort, of textbook effort, of geographic bulldozing effort in order to make the forgetting take hold. And it does take hold over time, and it takes hold. The settlement issues are the very spectacular issues. They're highly visible. They're the wall, when you see it, I mean, it is literally a scar upon a landscape. But this forgetting takes hold also at much more capillary levels. The contests over food between Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Israel, I think, are one example of that. The kind of rehabilitation of old Arab buildings is another. So you need to pay attention, I think, also to these kind of small-scale processes in which forgetting is taking hold, as well as the more spectacular ones. In terms of the narrative, if you work on Palestine at all, my focus was Mandate Palestine, less contemporary Palestine, but even so, none of what you have said today is new. Actually, the skunk gas, the spraying of the skunk gas, that was new. But the rest of it, none of it was new. None of it, I learned absolutely nothing from what you said that was new to me. But which I'm not saying to diminish what you said, but because I think the location of the new story that you talked about, and I think the importance of narrative here is crucial, but the new story is not a new story for Palestine. The new story is a new story for Israel. And part of that new story is also the recognition of the centrality of the story, that histories of injustice, as you talked about for our own history in the United States, need to be recognized as not incidental, right? That Sand Creek is not an incidental, unfortunate accident that happened but doesn't affect the overall story of the history of Colorado, but they need to be recognized as integral to that history. And so it is about a new story, but it's a new story for some people. It's not a new story for others. And it's really about making the story stick, making that, the labor of making that take hold. From a political perspective, I think that this also raises the broader question, and for those of you who work on state issues, of sovereignty and of the relationship between sovereignty and morality. State sovereignty, right, comes to us from the 1600s, and we now see it in the United States and elsewhere as a democratic state sovereignty, but it at heart is the right to do what you want as the government of a particular state within the borders of your own state. And of course, I work on Syria, so that's how I see it now, and Russia's argument about Syria's sovereignty should be respected. But I think it's important also to recognize that the protection of sovereignty also protects against morality when it comes to the treatment of people inside. There are many, many ways to illustrate this, which I won't. But I think one would be the degrees of citizenship. This has been a concept that's been discussed over the past few years, semi-citizenship, partial citizenship, degrees of citizenship. To be involved in a civil rights movement presumes that the state recognizes the rights of people, but that these rights are filtered through citizenship. And I think it's important to make the distinction that civil rights are not the same as human rights, and the state guarantees civil rights or does not guarantee civil rights. So it is, from my view, not a parallel situation to talk about the civil rights movement in the United States and a kind of civil rights movement in Palestine or Israel, because there was, while there is parallel levels of discrimination, people in Palestine are, by definition, not citizens in Israel, whereas the history of the civil rights movement was about actualizing the citizenship that everyone should enjoy. I would also just close by making the cheerful point that we as a country actually support militarily and financially, but particularly militarily, two states where religion is a key determinant for citizenship, and having the wrong religion or the wrong sect is a source of state discrimination, or is a legitimation or legitimizing force for state determination. And so that, of course, the other state is Saudi Arabia. And so I think we might also ask more broadly about the long-term costs of that in terms of us as a democracy and us as the United States as a country that is officially religion neutral. So now I think we'll turn it over to other questions and comments, and I will de-mic myself. Yes? Okay.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for those
Yes,
comments.
thank you very much.
And Alan, did you want to say anything in response to Andrea's very interesting remarks before we open it up to discussion?
I don't think there was anything I disagreed with at all.
What about the part about you being a model engaged scholar?
No, I'm a jerk. That's not, don't worry about it. I appreciate the praise, but, you know.
I do have a couple of questions myself, but in the interest of time and participation, I'd like to open it up to the floor first, and maybe I can interject my questions if there's a lull in the discussion, which I hope there won't be. Yes.
A commercial. Senate Bill 176 passed the Senate and is now on its way to the House. This bill says that Colorado should invest in Israeli bonds. Then they amended it so that what happens is that the new amendment says that Colorado can invest in bonds with a blah blah rating, of which Israel doesn't even have. But the bottom line is that a similar bill passed in Ohio, and then there was a rush to go ahead and invest in Israeli bonds. And there's I have a whole website here if anybody's interested on why nobody should be investing in Israeli bonds, because they keep juggling the value of the shekel, and you end up not getting your money paid back at the same rate at which you purchased it. But, anyway,
But that's the least of the problems. What's the address?
sorry?
What's your web address?
Oh, the web address for that one is, it's www.israelbonds.com. Anyway, the hearing is going on at 1:30 today in the building just south of the Capitol at Renovating Q Church, and it's room LSB-.
That's in 15 minutes, so I don't think anyone's going to make it. I hope no one
I'm
leaves.
going to run down there, but I'm hoping people would say
not yet.
no to your House representatives, vote no on 176. I have lots of other reasons why to vote no, but a lot of it says what I'm going to say about how we treat the Palestinians.
Thank you for that announcement. Yes.
So my name is Kelly Baker, and I lived in Palestine for 6 months. I was actually there when the delegation was there and found out Dr. Harding. I'm a student over at ILIF, so I work with Dr. Harding on occasions. And I found out he was in Bethlehem the day after you guys left. I was like, I know you. But I actually had met with Dr. Harding after I had returned. And one of the conversations that we were having was very much that you guys went with this idea of comparing the civil rights movement here with what's going on there. And he said what he pulled away was more of the similarities between the Native Americans and how, because of the same issue of what you were talking about, how Palestinians in the West Bank aren't actually citizens of Israel, so it's not a civil rights issue. And so he was looking at it as being much more of a comparison with what was happening with the Native Americans here, which I think is really powerful, and that's one of the things that I've been trying to, as I've been sharing my stories with people, and trying to help people here in this country, in the U.S., understand what is happening there. Is the closest comparison that we have is the usurpation of this land and the cultural genocide of Native Americans. That's exactly what's happening in the West Bank, and it's been happening for the past 65 years, and it will continue to happen until people in this country start to put pressure on Israel and make them change their behavior.
So he had lunch with me
Yes.
afterwards, and what he told me about was that he and Rachel, his daughter, had discussed this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a point that the analogy is neater. Not that there isn't the analogy which I was fleshing out for you about the founding slave owners and the myths involved in this. But the analogy is a much neater one. And I had done stuff about Native Americans, but I and my wife went down and photographed the monument allegedly to an anonymous soldier of the Civil War at the state capitol. We'd written a letter to the Denver Post protesting the monument to Chivington, and they said, it isn't a monument to Chivington. It's a monument to an anonymous soldier of the Civil War. And actually, there's a plaque, the Western plaque, which is to Chivington, who did the massacre, Evans. At the bottom, it says that there are 3 white guys who discovered gold. They were actually indigenous people who unfortunately discovered the gold that led to the rapid settlement of Colorado. And there are lists of battles, including the Sand Creek Battle. And there are 4 battles in Colorado, and every one of them is part of the War of Empire to wipe out Native Americans. And I'm just putting up on my blog a series about John Evans and documents he wrote. And one of the things I'm talking about is the Civil War is a noble fight against slavery. And it is a great thing and stands out in history with the war against the Nazis as a war which has real moral, deep moral justification, at least of America's sort of wars. I mean, it's the revolution, but after that, you know, there's a civil war and so on. You look at most of the other wars, we stole half of Mexico. We're sitting in Colorado, which is not a, what I say, Mayflower name for a state. And so it seems like there's a problem. But the situation is, as you say, one of complete denial of the humanity of indigenous people. If you have Apache blood in movies quite recently, you are dangerous. If a white woman is captured by Indians, will they take her back because you know she's caught cooties from being with the Indians? I mean, you know, I've forgotten the name of the movie. It has John Wayne in it. They really have a debate over that. And I don't think it has a happy end. I don't quite remember the ending. But if you look at this and you look at Palestinians, you will see very, very clearly that we are a settler state like Israel. And the truth is that all of the states in the Americas are settler states, and all of them have committed ethnic cleansing or genocide against indigenous people. And we have to look at this differently if we're going to have. I'll say one other thing about it. I'll say 2 things about it. One, I'm putting up a series on the blog, and if any of you would actually like to get the blog, if you would give me your email, I will send it to you. So I'll pass this around. But the other is this. I'm on this University Senate committee with George Tinker, who is a professor at Iliff. He's a Native American. And George was writing to me about this, and he said, you know, there's a lot about Native Americans in the war, hostility in the war in Iraq. And I had been saying, you know, wiping out Native Americans and wiping out children has something to do with Sandy Hook. People said that was the only massacre of children in American history. And it wasn't, right? And it has something to do with why even Barack kills non-white people and doesn't remember why. I mean, it isn't a problem, you know, it's all right. He's got to be a tough guy vis-a-vis Romney. He didn't have to take out bin Laden that way. We had the Joint Special Operations Command which did that, right? Not a single drone has actually ever done anything useful, if I may say. We've done a lot of harm to the United States with drones. It's made Barack a tough guy, so he got through the election with these crazy people. So here's what I wrote Tink asking him, why are you saying this? Come on, tell me more. So he told me the following story, and actually I've now run down the brother of the person in the story, who was Glenn Morris, whom I know a little bit. He said, there's a Shawnee Indian I know, and he joined the army, and there he was, poised to enter Iraq with 2 other American soldiers. And they're on the border in 2003, and they have their helmets off. So a colonel comes up and is all irate and demands that they have their helmets on. I guess it will stop the poison gas that they think Saddam has if they got their helmets on, because the American military is really smart. So anyway, the colonel says to them, gentlemen, this is Indian country. And Geronimo's rifle is at West Point in the museum. And his saddle is in Fort Sill. And among the battlefield experiences is the extinction of indigenous people by the American military as part of its great heroic effort. And you taught this, and they worshiped this, and it was right on this guy's lips. And if you think it's far removed from many of the things, I was a leader of the anti-Iraq war movement here, and I know from this, right? It wouldn't have occurred to me to say, you know, the domestic genocide and amnesia toward indigenous people is linked to how these people can get people to make crazy war against, as Richard Clarke says, it was as if FDR had been hit with Pearl Harbor and attacked Mexico.
follow up on that last question with another question for you, Alan, which is that because this is a common argument, and you yourself used the term settler state. Israel is often called a colonial settler state.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that one place where that formulation runs into trouble, and the analogy with the conquest of the Americas and the extermination of the native peoples here breaks down, is that unlike the case of the European colonial settlers of the Americas, the Zionists, the original Jewish settlers of Palestine, did actually have a historical, cultural, civilizational, religious connection to the land, which in no way morally justifies any of the dehumanization, mistreatment, violence, and injustice that has taken place there. But there is an actual historical connection between the Jewish people and the land of Palestine, whereas there was no historical connection between the people of England or Spain and the Western Hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd just like you to respond to that, because I think it's an issue that should, it would be interesting to hear your take on that.
No, it's a really good question. I'll stand up again.
Or Andrea, for that matter.
Yeah, Andrea. What's this one? Well,
And. Or and.
Good. The Holocaust is an event of enormous power. It is an event in which Europe tried to murder every Jew. It also murdered Roma, it murdered gay people, it murdered Slavs, but the driving edge of it, the heart of the racism that murdered everyone. So, as Pastor Niemöller said, I did nothing when everybody else was being murdered, and when they came for me, there was no one left to protest. Was the genocide against Jews. And this goes way back in Europe. It's the pogroms in Russia. It's the Spanish Inquisition and having to be a converso and being settled in New Mexico. Oh, I apologize, I didn't shut off my phone. Oh dear. Caught out by my cell phone. This is really, I was actually trying to make a point. Well, I'll just let it run its course and you'll forgive me. It's beneath the microphone, so I'll rip that out if I keep going. So look, to me, the rationale for Zionism was Jews are being murdered in Europe and you needed a place where Jews can be safe. Friends I respect who are leftists in Israel have that view. And that really, there's been a lot of murder of Jews, and Europe isn't a trustworthy place. And if you think Europe is a trustworthy place, you don't know its history. Just like you think America is a trustworthy place, you don't know its history. And so, I must say, I don't think Israel is a particularly trustworthy example of anything either. But the rationale for this is that. And I think that's real and deep and powerful and moral. Although I admire the people, including Hannah Arendt and I.F. Stone and Judah Magnus, who said, really, if Israel's going to be a decent place, it passes through the village of the Palestinians and not through their destruction and not through their denial. And I don't think that Israel is a particularly decent place, and I think it's a long way up to get there. And Amira Haas, whom I admire immensely, gave an interview with Amy Goodman, and she said, you know, I've been working on this for 20 years and it's getting worse. Now, one other matter. I know that 2,000 years ago, Jews had something to do there with Palestine and they got kicked out. And it's very sad that they got kicked out, and I have absolutely no problem with people going back there and being part of any kind of decent, rights-respecting society for everybody. But the other thing is, we ran across these people, and this was an interesting division in our delegation. We went to Hebron, And the people who had organized our delegation, which were the Interfaith Peace Brigades, had arranged for us to meet with a guy from New Jersey whose name was David Wilder. And David Wilder is one of the settlers who's an ideological settler, right? So he came in, there were 3 of us who stayed on the bus. Reverend Sekou, who's black, who said, I ain't gonna meet with this guy. And a fellow from Cornell, a very good fellow, and me. And while I was happy enough that I heard from other people about the conversation, I actually thought that the settlers should be stopped. And I'm sorry that this kind of racism has to be stopped. And I really wasn't terribly interested in canvassing his point of view. But he had his prayer strings, his tzitzis, and his Glock. He doesn't work, he's just settled there. He just gets a lot of money from the Israeli state to settle there and walk around with his gun. So we were out on the bus, and I said to Saeed, the Arab Palestinian who was the tour guide, I said, you know, how about we go out and get a cup of coffee? And he said, well, I'd get rousted if I went out, but I'll tell you where the coffee shop is, and you can go see my friend there, and I'll get you a cup of coffee, you and the other guys. And I said, no, we'll stay here on the bus with you. So up the street came 6 kids with guns. And they're on 24-hour patrol that Jews-only street. And then there's a guy, you know, with his kippah, and he was walking along, looking at his Torah, I guess, and in another world. And another guy in the kippah who was on a cell phone. It could have been anybody, right? And otherwise, it was just these soldiers walking right next to us with their big guns, an Ethiopian Jew in the lead, and he wasn't holding the trigger, but the guy in the back, man, he was holding the trigger. So David Wilder, the settler, talked about Judea and Samaria, and right across the street, there were big designs for Judea and Samaria. You know what it was? It was a military base. So personally, I think Mel Brooks could have captured the spirit of this kind of affection for Jewish tradition, and I will say something about it. I haven't identified much of my adult life as a Jew, but I do strongly identify with the prophets who speak the truth to power. That is to say, Amos, whom Martin Luther King likes to quote, that great passage about the let justice roll down like waters, truth roll down like waters, and justice like an everlasting stream. And the Jews have always been victims of the oppressors. And they've done worse than stone throwing, at least if I understand their God taking out the first sons of the Egyptians, something which doesn't make me favor Yahweh very much, I must say. I do have objections to some kinds of violence. So it seems like there's a tradition of fighting the kings, not being the kings. There's also this other tradition in Judaism, which is being the kings and stepping on other people. And so I will just say, as a Jew, that if you tell me this, from what I saw, I think of Mel Brooks. And that's not because I don't worry about the rights of Jews, or I don't value Jews who feel the other way, or I don't want people to have the feeling that the Holocaust is a slight thing. When people say things that are as creepy as we're not as bad as the Nazis, particularly among Jews, that means something. It means something very negative about them, right? Boy, that's a comparison set you do not want to get into. You be a Jew.
Can I just
Yes.
with the microphone and ask again also? Okay, so you're right that it's the analogy, all analogies break down. I talk about this with my students. Analogies are useful to think with. They are not perfect. But you're right. I mean, there's both the historical relationship with Jerusalem from a Judaic perspective, and there's also, therefore, the resulting debate over whether Palestinians are native, right? Which is the political argument that Palestinians are Arab and have somewhere else to go. It's not clear when they came to Palestine based on that historicization, but that's the other side of the argument. So yes, the analogy is not perfect. And you can talk about this historically in terms of Zionist immigration into Palestine under the Ottomans. It's under the Ottomans, only a quarter of the people who come to Palestine stay. They find it very difficult. They find Abdul Hamid's governance really unpleasant, as everyone else did in the Ottoman Empire, so they're very much in line with that. But it's not until the 30s that the return rates for Zionist immigration are below 50%, and it has much to do with the change in Europe. And if you ever feel like doing even English language research, I mean, I think of old early 30s Palestine Post articles that I read that are just heartbreaking, and they say things like, Hitler has hired a Jewish doctor, as if like that's going to help make things better. I mean, it's tremendously sad, but that's also why the immigration rates turn. But I think that the question of the analogy, whether it's civil rights or settler state or Native Americans, is less whether that's a 100% accurate representation than what is it, so what does it spur you to do today? I mean, as a historian, there are times when history, quite frankly, is a little bit irrelevant. And the question is, what do you want to use that? What are the choices we're going to make today? And I think that becomes the more important question. So it's the utility of the analogy rather than the necessity.
Can I just bring something up? Because when I hear these discussions, I start to feel my rage build about how people treat one another and the direction the U.S. has gone in. And I was one of those people who voted for Barack Obama, and I have no respect for him at this point, you know, and yet I see people really so tentatively walking around our representatives and politicians, and to me, they deserve our rage. They deserve our rage for murder. I mean, this ongoing murder in the name of the United States. We're killing people, constantly killing people. We're killing American citizens, and you know, people go about their daily life and their things. We're all drinking our wine or our Kool-Aid, and I just, yeah, I find it so infuriating. And when we just talk about things, nothing gets done, and when we try to do things, our own police state steps in and oppresses us. You know, I mean, I'm glad that Berkeley was able to divest, and I hope that happens at the University of Denver as well.
The University of Denver is doing something really interesting about Sand Creek and Evans. And next year is the 150th anniversary. And there will be, despite the fact that this is not a largely political campus in the way Berkeley is, it's a fairly rare event here to have a big political thing. It's very significant. And I think you can look at many people and say, you know, why does America do such horrible things? And I never expected America not to do horrible things. I've never thought of America as a particularly nice place. I like Lincoln. I'm also very aware of Lincoln's faults, right? So when I said to you that, you know, yes, Obama has actually become, to some extent, a war criminal and is strengthening certain features of the Cheney way of doing things in executive power. That's true. The other thing that's true is that he's trying to get away from the most major wars. He's not hurrying to get American troops into yet another war. If he could do something about the Depression that was decent, he probably would. That is, there's a lot of pressure on him not to. I think one of the things is that what we have to think about is not getting ourselves so angry and so hurt that we stop doing things. And by doing things, I mean Occupy made Obama Obama again. We need some movement. What?
They stole their rhetoric and then...
They didn't steal their... Look, one of the things about it is there's still people in Occupy doing stuff about homelessness and doing stuff about foreclosures. And, you know, there are a lot of us who are in Occupy who would like to do other things. And I think one of the things is it's very hard to build up successful movements from below. You know, racism here was from the founding with slavery and stayed after the Civil War with the new Jim Crow, and now, as Michelle Alexander says, is the new Jim Crow. Even with Obama, they got 2.3 million people in prison. A lot of them are black, and that's 25% of the world's prisoners. And frankly, we're the biggest police state in the world. And we got Barack Obama to be president, who has pictures of Gandhi and King and Lincoln in his office, and he actually knows what they said. So, to some extent. So, I think that the thing one has to think about is what the wisest course is, and I want to say one thing about that, which I haven't told you. But there's a guy named Sami Awad. He's a Palestinian Christian, and he was the wisest person we met there. And he came to East Jerusalem. It was the first time in 10 years he had been allowed to come to Jerusalem. And what he gave a talk, and then we met with him for an afternoon afterwards. And here's what he said. He's a Palestinian who has suffered the Nakba, the catastrophe, under Israel. He and his family, right? His father was nonviolent, and he's nonviolent. So he can tell you about the oppression and the politics of it beautifully. But what he said that was profound and moving was exactly this, that there's a difference between tactical or even strategic nonviolence and really having it in your soul and really being nonviolent. And the example he gave was this. He went to Bergen-Belsen and Birkenau and to look at the camps. And he did this because he wanted to find out what Jews had suffered. Would that there were Jews, I hope I'm one of them, but who would go look at how the Palestinians have suffered and say something about it in the same way, right? And so he was at the camp, and there was this Israeli tour guide, and he doesn't know Hebrew, but he was talking to these little kids, and he was using over and over again the Arab word hara. And apparently, some of you know better than I, this is shit. And so he said to somebody who knew what the guy was saying, what's he saying? And what he's saying is, they murdered your grandparents. And as the Europeans murdered your grandparents, the Arabs will murder you today unless you arm yourselves and prepare to defend Israel. Now you try that on yourself at age 10 going to the camps. I'll tell you, I've been to Dachau, and it's a place that's going to be a dead hole in the earth. There's some nuns there who are, trying to cure it a little bit. But, 500 years hence, humanity's going to be gone. But it's still going to be a dark place there, for what they did, right? So they are training people to go kill. And so what he said was, all this, obviously suicide bombing where you kill innocent people helps the right wing in Israel. And the missile firing by Hamas does too. But he's actually against violence. And what he said was, when the Israeli government decided to go on daylight savings time and set back the clocks, all the Palestinians didn't cooperate. So they all showed up on the old time. And this happened for a week, and Israel got completely frantic and didn't know what to do with it, right? And we were discussing other aspects of nonviolence, like these very successful, interestingly, protests against the wall, although, by the way, in this little village I mentioned, after we left, they went and had a demonstration in a supermarket in the settlement, and the guy, Bassem Tamimi, who'd been in jail for 12 months, he was in the demonstration. So when they came out of the store, the Israeli Defense Forces beat them up and smashed his ribs, and then they took him away to jail for 4 months. Again. So the price for nonviolent, and they killed another kid named Rushdie Tamimi, who's 27, also, 2 weeks after we left. And this isn't in Gaza. This is in the West Bank. These are people doing nonviolent demonstrations. The courage necessary to do nonviolence in Israel is the courage necessary to do it in the Deep South, in the civil rights movement. And what it is that Awad was saying was, we have to have a nonviolent movement which disarms the paranoia, which is immense, because it's based on something, right? Europeans want to kill Jews. Europeans have lived off killing Jews. Europeans have killed more Jews in more grotesque ways. There are greater numbers of native indigenous people have been killed. But the fact is, millions and millions and millions of people who were civilians were slaughtered in Europe European civilization, the word makes me sick. I mean, I very much value freedom, and there's some nice things about Europe. But Europe is a big colonialist, racist killer, and what they did to the Jews is a big example of it. And the fact is that there are a lot of people in Israel who may blow up the world because they're quite crazy, because they've been made crazy. And Sami Awad is wise enough to see that. And Sami Awad is wise enough to try to figure out how to reach out about that. And if he becomes a great leader in this, because he's not a Muslim, if he becomes a great leader in this, in a certain way he already is, it will change the world. And we have to hope that people like that, who have that kind of wisdom, become the leaders of this.
Alan, what you've just said actually reminds me very much of the title of Avram Berg's book. You mentioned Berg. His book's title is The Holocaust is Over. We must rise from its ashes. And what
Amen.
You could have actually gone much further when you mentioned Berg.
Please do.
Well, you mentioned that he was a member of the Knesset. He also happens to have been a very high-ranking officer in the Israel Defense Forces and a devout and practicing Orthodox Jew. In other words, it would be hard to imagine a more mainstream, passionate Israeli nationalist, Zionist conservative. And Avram Berg, as you pointed out, but I don't think you dated it, it was 2006 during Israel's, shall we say, incursion into Lebanon.
Okay.
In the summer of 2006, Berg, who was at that point still quite mainstream, was at a dinner party when this report of this Israeli attack on this civilian building in southern Lebanon came out. And one of his interlocutors, a sort of an Israeli friend, said, yes, I did hear about that, but we don't have gas chambers. And something snapped in Avram Berg that night, at that moment. He realized that the moral calculus in the Israeli mind was such that as long as we aren't doing what the Nazis did to us, as long as we don't have gas chambers, then it's okay. And Berg set out from that night forward to unravel this moral nightmare that he felt his country had slipped into. And I want to just put this question to you, Alan, because you are, aside from being a blogger and an activist and a part-time historian, you're also...
I'm a full-time historian.
Well, you're a political...
I'm full-time many other things.
But you're a political philosopher, and that's
okay.
my point. And philosophers ask not only how, but why.
Mm-hmm. Smart historians do.
And well, I like Andrea's point, though, that sometimes history is irrelevant. History is not irrelevant to this, but I want to ask you a philosophical question.
You win.
That Berg asks in his book, which is, why? How did we get from, you mentioned a very interesting term at the outset of your talk today. You mentioned the term left-wing Zionist to describe one of the people who went with you to Palestine on your delegation.
Formally, yes.
A former left-wing Zionist. Now, the historian in me wants to ask you to explain for some of the younger folks in this room, for whom the term left-wing Zionist might sound like unmarried bachelor, a contradiction in terms, an oxymoron, something so bizarre or anachronistic at the very least that it just doesn't register, okay? So part of me would like to hear you explain what did that term ever mean, but I'd actually like to ask you a more pointed question, which is how did things get from a point in time when there was such a thing as left-wing Zionist, when many Zionists were actually socialists, anarchists, radicals, and pacifists, to a time when, as Avram Berg says, the moral psyche of contemporary Israel has gotten to the point where, as he describes that evening, as long as things have not descended to the level of the Nazis, it's justified. In other words, why? Berg offers his own explanation, which I think you touched on a few minutes ago. He sees Israel as the classic abused child that has become an abusive parent, a deeply psychologically scarred people, his people. I'd just like to get you to reflect a little bit as a philosopher on where, on why this turn of events has taken the shape that it has.
Well, those are a couple of really good questions. And maybe I'll put it, I put it in a sort of slogan form, because as an anti-Nazi and a Jew, and I'm now nonviolent, but I wasn't always, and I have actually been in fights with neo-Nazis in the Ku Klux Klan, so if you want to know. You may not want to know, but I'll just tell you that as far as it goes, I have organized to take out Nazis in the Klan and think it's an honorable thing to do. And anybody who says to me, oh, political science says that you can be value-free, and it's really 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, whether you look at things from the Nazi point of view, the anti-Nazi point of view. I'm sorry, I don't think that there's a moral argument that you can identify for that point of view, and I don't think it makes any sense as a point of view, and I've argued that otherwise. So look, I look at the Palestinians and I say, you know, they're the Jews of the occupied territories. Because I know from Europe, I'm afraid, I've seen some Jews, and I remember how Jews were treated by Nazis. And I'm really glad that Israel hasn't decided to exterminate them all yet, but the way they are treated is not right. I mean, very not right. And the oppressors have identified themselves as Europeans, and this is a common thing in radical movements.
Not all of them.
Hang on. Okay, I agree with you. So what I wanted to say about, this was the second part.
Many of them are Sephardic.
Well, I will just say about this that the Sephardics, and there's some Sephardics, and there are many Orthodox Jews who seem to want to make Greater Israel be a place without Palestinians. And the government seems to be furthering that as a policy. And that's a European policy of uprooting the people who are there. And in this case, the people who are like the Jews. And the Jews are doing to the people who are like the Jews in that situation the thing that was done to them in Europe. And it's very hard to bear. And by the way, in our group, there wasn't a single person who didn't realize that. As I said, there wasn't a single person who didn't know about the Holocaust and wasn't deeply sympathetic to Israelis living as human beings on the planet without threat, right? But they have to live in a state where they recognize the rights of other people, and it has to develop there that everybody is treated as a human being. So about the core philosophical issue, or it's a philosophical sociological issue, often people who have been oppressed, you can find this in union leaders who were once militants and then sell out their workers. As the phrase sell out is a common phrase, and it's often very applicable. You can find it in many movements when people come to power. Communists in power tend to be rather unattractive compared to the things they did before they were in power, often. So it's not something which is the psychological mechanism involved is not something that is unique to Jews. Now, the other thing is, many, many people in Israel wanted a decent, democratic, socialist regime. Zionism was a form of national socialism. And people like Leo Strauss, who supported it because it was like Nazism. He was actually a national socialist in sympathy in Germany, and they wouldn't let him in, the Nazi party. And he had some affection for this in Israel. And there were right-wing people who did. Who were pro-Mussolini or pro-Hitler and so on. But there were a ton of left-wing people, and a lot of the kibbutzes were formed by people, for example, who admired, misguidedly, Mr. Stalin, but they thought they were organizing a cooperative like the ones in Russia, right? So the fact that the union movement wouldn't let Arabs be members, or Arabs couldn't join the kibbutz, should have been a problem, because one of the main principles of communism is internationalism. That is to say that if you allow others to be stepped on, you're going to get stepped on. So you have to have a movement which recognizes and fights for the most oppressed people. And so a national socialism is likely to collapse in this way into some sort of more right-wing regime. So I went to Israel, and they had no memory of the kibbutz. We walked into Tel Aviv airport, and you couldn't tell that there was a kibbutz ever in Israel. Socialism, communism, not a chance, right? Not a whiff. Now, if you read Haaretz and you read Amira Haas and you read Gideon Levy, you'll get an idea that there are some leftists in Israel, and they'll talk about it, right? And they actually have open debate. As Amira says, you know, the other people didn't read her stuff, so it was only when she put in the first sentence that Palestinians have a right to resist and throwing rocks is natural. It was only then that she caused a stir. You put it halfway down through her article and they never paid any attention. So there is this big left-wing force, and actually I have put up a post by a woman named Zion, and I've forgotten her first name now. It was in the New York Review of Books. And she lives in Cedaro. And she says, well, we try to make links with the people elsewhere, and also we have a cooperative, and we live off what we do cooperatively. And every time the planes fly over, Netanyahu his letter to Netanyahu is sending out the military, we get killed. So we don't find the Israeli military taking off to, you know, bomb and blow up Palestinians a good thing. We find it a completely harmful alien thing. There are lots and lots of Jews who feel that way. There are Jews in all of these organizations we met. The leader of the Committee Against Housing Demolition is a Jew. And the fact is that many, many Israelis have fought for peace, and some of them, like Uri Avneri, for all his life, you know, are kind of grand figures. And so to minimize that, you know, it's not like, oh, Jews in America, because most Jews in America by now do not want war with Iran and would like to see Israel change. A lot of Jews are in the leadership of the boycott and divestment movement, everywhere. And that's a pretty good thing, if I may say. And that does reflect this duality of the Jewish tradition in which the prophets still play a role. So I don't know if that's
I think that's a very profound note on which to close. I want to thank all of you for being here. This was a very rich discussion. I want to thank Andrea Stanton for her very valuable remarks as discussant. I want to thank you, Alan, for sharing your insights and experiences with us. And I want to encourage all of you to get on the email list for Alan's blog and also the email list for the Center for Middle East Studies. If you want to give me your email address, I'd be happy to add you. And I'd like to encourage you all also to have some more pizza because I ordered too much. Thank you very much.
Well, they also have my book outside.
Yes.
And if anybody'd like to get one, I would be thrilled to sign it.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, brother.
Thank
Good
you.
stuff.
Good stuff.